Hello students, welcome to the second session on T.S. Eliot's essay Tradition and Individual Talent. In the previous introductory session, we had discussed about T.S. Eliot as a literary artist, T.S. Eliot as a critic, along with a brief introduction with this very essay, the key ideas expressed in this very essay, and this essay is termed as the unofficial manifesto of T.S. Eliot's critical creed. It is termed as unofficial because in his lifetime T.S. Eliot has never submitted that this essay he has given any theory, and the seeds of his theory are there in this very essay, but it is a manifesto because in this essay we find the exposition of his principles and his theories regarding the creative process, which were explained in his later works. So today we will talk about the very concept of tradition which is discussed in this essay, and we just recapitulate what we have done earlier. This essay was first published in 1919 in the literary supplement of Time, The Egoist, and later it got published in his first volume on criticism, The Sacred Wood, Essays on Poetry and Criticism. And if we look at the structure of the essay, this essay is divided into three parts. In the first part, Eliot talks about his concept of tradition. In the second part, he explains his theory of impersonal poetry, and the third part is there in the form of conclusion. So today we'll talk about his concept of tradition. Students, this T.S. Eliot opens the essay, or he begins with the explanation about the term tradition, and he talks about that how tradition, and the term tradition is not accepted in a positive light, and in English literature and literary criticism it is often used in a derogatory sense. It is used usually as a word of censure rather than praise, and when it is used as praise, which is seldom, and it is only in connection with archaeological artifacts. So as far as the creative process or the literature or the literary criticism is concerned, it is disagreeable. It is just used in derogatory sense, and whenever they talk about the greatness or something good in a particular poet, then they do not talk about, or they do not give importance to the if one creative mind is following the tradition or is following his predecessors. In the next part of the essay, he talks about the question of the individuality of the poet, how it is being emphasized upon in the English critical circles. And he says that we pretend to find that what is individual, what is peculiar essence of man. And the English ear, according to T.S. Eliot, the English ear gets satisfied. Ears get satisfied upon a poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his immediate predecessors. And English ear tries to find out something which can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. Means the individuality, means that a poet gets appreciation for individuality, that how different he is from his predecessors. So but Eliot believes that when we just open ourselves, when we look at a particular word with a broader interpretations, then we find that the most individual parts of a particular creative work may be those in which that creative artist, that creative genius has followed his ancestors, the dead poets. So in here, he just wants to make it very clear that tradition is not an imitation. Tradition is not slavish imitation. Tradition is not blind adherence to the ways of one's predecessors. Because he talks about that tradition has very wide implications. So, so Eliot's concept of tradition is not one of passive imitation of the past. It is not the blind and timid following of the ways of the previous generations. And this kind of imitation, Eliot believed that it should be firmly discouraged. And because it is not the true tradition. And this is not the tradition that we are just slavishly copying someone, because tradition is not something which can be inherited. It must be obtained with great labor. And he explains that tradition is to be consciously acquired through great labor. And how it happens, how tradition cannot be inherited and it can be acquired or obtained, because it involves a lot of hard work on the part of creative genius. It involves the knowledge of past writers and their scholarship. And how this acquiring of tradition through labor gives a wider interpretation to the concept tradition. He talked the three layers of this very concept of tradition in terms of its involvement with the historical sense. And by this historical sense, Eliot means to say that tradition involves not only the pastness of past, but also its presence. Means that the historical sense is indispensable to anyone who wants to continue being a poet, because this historical sense involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past but also of its presence. Means a poet with the historical sense would feel that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer is within it, and the whole of literature of his own country has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. So in other words, it is a sense of timeless as well as of temporal together, and this is what makes a writer traditional. This historical sense, this sense of timelessness as well as temporality. And the past is not to be seen in isolation. It is related to the present and continues in and through it. So a writer's own work is a part of continuing tradition. So in this continuing of tradition, in this involvement of the pastness of past along with the presence of the past, requires a lot of hard work. And how it happens, here he talks about the three layers which I have just mentioned. Number one, that tradition involves recognition of the continuity of creative process, and that how the literature of a particular age and how the idea of a particular creative genius moves forward to the coming generations, to recognize that very sense of continuity, that why a particular thing continues, why a particular idea continues, to recognize that very continuity. And this recognition requires a sense of critical judgment, that which of the writers of the past continue to be significant in the past. So in this way, the knowledge of the significant works also comes into the scene. So in this way, tradition represents the accumulation of wisdom and experience of the age. And so its knowledge is essential for really great and noble achievements. And as the tradition involves this specific sort of historical sense with the fusion of past and present, so it's quite clear that Eliot is not talking about tradition as a static process. He talks about tradition as a dynamic concept. It is not anything fixed or static. It is constantly changing, growing, and becoming different from what it is, because it has the sense of present also. It is the individual talent which modifies it. A writer in the present must seek guidance from the past, but just as the past directs and guides the present, so present alters the past. So the relationship between the past and the present is not one-sided. It is reciprocal relationship, and this reciprocal relationship between past and present is the which gives dynamism to the very nature of tradition, which Eliot has explained. T.S. Eliot talks further that when we look at the concept of tradition in terms of its involvement of historical sense, then we find that no poet, no artist has his complete meaning alone. Because a poet who is conscious of tradition will be aware that his work would have to be compared and contrasted with the works of the past and judged by the standards of the past. So Eliot explained that by the term judgment, he does not mean that poet would be adjudged better or worse than the poets of the past. It doesn't mean determining whether the present work is better or worse than those of the past. Nor does it mean judging the present work by the standards set by previous critics. Eliot talks about the different ways in which a poet can be related to the past. In Eliot's opinion, a poet cannot take the past in a lump as a whole without any discrimination. The past must be carefully examined and only the significant taken into account. Nor can a poet form himself wholly on a few poets of the past whom he admires. Though this course is an important experience of youth, a poet cannot form himself on any one period he prefers. This course is pleasant as a supplement. It is not the real sense of tradition. A poet's relations with the past lies in his awareness of the main current. What is very important to note that this main current need not necessarily flow through the most distinguished reputations. A poet has to discriminate the main current from all that is irrelevant or only topical or circumstantial. So it is necessary to remember that Eliot insists that the smaller poets should not be neglected. If one is to obtain a consciousness of the main current of tradition. So he also implies that a poet needs a critical faculty where a mutual relationship between past and present takes place. So in this way, that the poet or the creative artist has to observe the past so as to able to express the present. So, and how is the poet to observe the past? Eliot is conscious that his theory of tradition would be criticized on the basis that it requires too much of erudition, that the poet should be very wise and erudite. Only then he can pick up, he can absorb that which points of past he has to just relate with the present. So there have been the poets who have not been learned but great all the same. It would also be said that too much of learning would deaden sensibility. But here, Eliot does not mean mere bookish knowledge or superficial knowledge gained with the intention of impressing people for publicity. Knowledge, true knowledge, should go beyond this. The capacity for absorbing knowledge differs from one person to another, and some are able to absorb it without much difficulty, others have to work hard for it. And Eliot gives an example of Shakespeare and Plutarch. He says that Shakespeare was able to get more knowledge of history from Plutarch than many can from British Museum. So a poet must develop a consciousness of past and should continue to develop this consciousness through his career. So a poet's relationship with the past involves a self-surrender to something which is of greater value than himself. He has to surrender himself to a literary tradition. So the artist is continually engaged in the extinction of his own personality. At this very note, Eliot closes the first part of his essay, that an artist is continually engaged in the extinction of his personality. Means the artist has to be objective. He has to depersonalize his emotions. He has to work for that how the past can be altered by the present and how the present can alter the past. So this very mutual relationship takes place in the creative process, and how that artist surrender himself, how that artist should be objective, that is discussed by Eliot in the second part of essay, where he talks about poetry as an impersonal process, or he talks about his impersonal theory of poetry, that how that in the creative process the creative artist or the poet has to be objective. So in the next video we'll talk about Eliot's theory of impersonal poetry, and in this session he had made it very clear that tradition plays an important role in the poetic process, and tradition is not blind adherence to past, but tradition involves the sense of the reciprocal relationship between past and present. So that is the key concern of Eliot's concept of tradition. Thank you.